Have you ever found yourself making the same mistake in your chess games over and over again, game after game? Well, I certainly have. And last weekend, there was a great example of this. I was playing in a local tournament, and in round one, I got hit with kind of this interesting little tactic that I totally misplayed. Like I completely didn't see what was going on and then misplayed it after it happened. But the interesting thing is, I actually played another tournament about a month or so ago, and I got hit with the same tactic, and I misplayed it in a very similar way. And so there's definitely something to learn here. Let's dive in and have a look. So this was round one of the St. Mary's Open, which was held at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and a shout out to the Chess Nova Scotia team for putting this tournament together. In round one, I was playing with the black pieces. And here we go. So my opponent started with e4, and I played the Caro-Kann, and then they played bishop c4. And this kind of has a hilarious name. It's called the Hillbilly Attack, apparently. And it kind of arises when white tries to play the bishop's opening against the Caro-Kann. And it's generally not an amazing way to play against the Caro-Kann, because after d5, which is typical for Caro-Kann players, you can trade the pawns in the middle, but then the bishop is just going to slide back to b3, and it's going to be fairly useless, especially when this pawn inevitably comes to e6 at some point. But anyway, that's what we did, and I developed my knights. And then after knight f3, I developed my bishop to g4, which is a pretty typical developing square for the bishop in the Caro-Kann. But in this opening, in this variation, it actually has an extra threat. Because if I capture this knight, then white is faced with a pretty unpleasant choice. Either they recapture with the queen, which is typical, but then they drop this pawn, or they recapture with the g-pawn, which will give them a pretty messed up pawn structure on the king side. So I think my opponent didn't really recognize this, and so he played h3. I took here, and he decided to take with the g-pawn. He opted for the damaged pawns instead of moving the queen out and losing that pawn. Also with a tempo on the queen, by the way. And so that was kind of a nice a nice little bit of an advantage to get right in the beginning of the game. I decided to play g6 because since I've traded off my light squared bishop already, I like to try to get lots of pawns on light squares. This one's going to go to e6 eventually as well. And so fianchettoing the bishop makes a lot of sense. Also, when the g-file is semi-open like this, having a fianchetto setup makes it very hard for a rook on the g-file to cause many problems for you. So just a fun little tip there. Knight c3, I complete my fianchetto, and then bishop g5. Now there's a threat here. This pawn is under pressure. Despite the bishop not being very useful in general in this opening, it is causing some pressure on that pawn along with the knight. And I have two defenders along with the two attackers, but he is threatening to remove one of my defenders. And so I played e6. I had wanted to play e6 anyway. It kind of walks into a pin, but I felt like that, now I don't have to worry about my pawn chain as much. So this pawn is feeling quite good. So queen d2 and queen b6. Now I'm used to these fianchettoed positions because I used to play the Pierce defense a lot, and I play the King's Indian defense as black. And one of the strategies is to trade off the dark squared bishops with a setup like this, castle long, and then try to launch an attack here on the king side. And so I was a little bit like, I was aware of this possibility, but I felt like probably the attack didn't have a lot of strength behind it, simply because the pawns are so damaged. There isn't a healthy pawn structure that can cause a pawn storm and gives him lots of possibilities for attack. So I wasn't too worried. I brought my queen out, which just adds some pressure onto that pawn. He castles long, which serves to defend that pawn as well by adding the rook there. And I castled short. So again, I was a little bit concerned about having my dark squared bishop traded off and possibly an attack, but I felt like probably there wasn't much that he could do there, and I have lots of pieces over here. I have an open C file or a semi-open C file, and I should be able to launch a pretty good attack over here on the queen side. So knight a4, kind of pushing my queen away, which was a little bit annoying, and I was expecting maybe bishop f4 to hit the queen as well. He didn't play that right away. He played king b1 instead. And then I found this move, which I'm pretty happy with. It's not the top engine move, but the engine does like it, which is knight e8, which is a bit of a hard move to play, to be honest. Like, it seems like moving the knight back to the home row is not really, it's not moving in the right direction. It's not really what you want to do. But this move has a couple of nice things. First of all, the knight doesn't seem very useful on this square. Like, it can't really go anywhere. It's not really doing a lot. And so one thing I wanted to do was reroute it somewhere more useful. And from the d6 square, it could go over to f5, which seems like a really nice square, putting some pressure over here. Or eventually maybe even to c4 to just kind of put pressure on white's position, right? And so the queen, I should mention too that moving the knight also adds some immediate extra pressure to this pawn because it opens up the bishop. And so then if the knight ends up going here, then there's more pressure. And if someday I can move the queen back over here, there's even more pressure. So I'm really trying to kind of line things up against that pawn. So this defends the pawn because, if the queen is back here, then if I take with the knight, then they have to take back with their queen, which they don't want to do. And so this allows them to defend with the rook directly. I bring my knight to d6 as planned. Now they bring their bishop to f4, pinning the knight. And then I move my queen over here to get out of the way of the pin from the bishop. This is where I have a problem because what's happening here is this pawn is kind of pinned to the queen. And I say it's kind of pinned to the queen because this pin is a little bit nuanced, and this is the sort of thing that I have gotten hit with in a couple of games, and I don't seem to be able to see what's going on and to be able to play it right. Hopefully next time. Hopefully I've learned my lesson. But let me show you what's going on. This pawn is pinned, but right now it's not because the knight is defending the queen. So if white were to immediately try to exploit this pin and capture this pawn, then this actually just loses material for white because I can actually capture, and then after queen takes and knight takes, white is just down material. They've just given up a bishop for a pawn. However, this only works because of this knight that's defending the queen. So if this knight were to go away, then white actually could capture here because after I capture with my pawn, my queen is going to be captured. The other thing that white could do is they could do something like this, moving the rook behind their queen. And now, again, this is pinned because I guess I just need to play a waiting move, and then if takes, now through that exchange, white is up a pawn because they had an extra attacker, so I couldn't just simply recapture the queen with my knight. That knight falls as well. There may be some other moves in that variation, but I'm just showing you the main idea here. And the point is, I need to go back. There we go. The point is that this is kind of a weirdly nuanced pin. Like, it's not as simple as a pin like this, where the bishop is pinning the queen. And so, regardless of what happens, regardless of whether the queen is defended or not, if I move this knight, I'm going to lose my queen, and that's a bad thing. Whereas in this case, there are kind of more conditions. Like, I have to see how many attackers are coming down this file and how many defenders my queen has, or something like this. So needless to say, I didn't actually see that when we were playing the game. I was just completely had no concept that any of that was going on. So white plays c3, which I kind of expected at some point, solidifying this pawn and maybe giving the bishop a square. Although really, I'm covering a lot of these light squares here, and that bishop is still not going to be very strong. But I had been wanting to eventually move this knight to a5 in order to try to capture that bishop and damage the pawn structure. And so I went ahead and did that, which, as you can hopefully see at this point, was a mistake because the knight is what was defending this queen. And so now this pawn is pinned, and white immediately capitalized on that and immediately grabbed that pawn. The interesting thing about this position, which some of you may have seen this, it actually doesn't work for white. It actually doesn't work, but it doesn't work for a reason that I certainly was not going to see. So the move that I played, actually just pause the video here in just a second and see if you can find the move that gets black out of trouble. So when you've done that, this is the move that I played, which actually gets black out of trouble, but I didn't understand why. And the move is knight f5. I gave this move a lot of thought because at this point I was a little bit rattled, right? I had lost this pawn because of a pin that I hadn't seen, and I didn't know what to do. So I thought that my best bet was to move the knight here, which has a tempo, gains a tempo on the queen. The queen has to stay on this file, right? Otherwise, I can just simply capture the bishop. And then I thought that the best move, and I think it is, the best move is for the queen to come down here, defending this bishop. But my thought was that then I can just move my queen over, and this is a double attack on the bishop and the knight. It doesn't end up gaining me material, but what happens is the bishop goes back, and then I get my trade with the knight, and now this knight is in a pretty poor position over on the edge of the board, and I've damaged the pawn structure. But if we just go back here for a second, the other thing that this move does, which again, I did not see, is this knight now defends the queen, right? And so it comes with a tempo on the queen has to move, and now I can just capture that bishop. I totally could have just captured the bishop. And so, and if the queen captures, then I just capture her with the knight, and I'm totally fine. So probably black's or white's best bet is actually just to capture here and at least get a pawn for the bishop. But I just, like I said, I just do not seem to understand somewhere in my brain about these pins and the fact that when my queen is covered, then I'm not pinned anymore. I can totally just capture. And so that's a pretty interesting lesson. And as I mentioned, there was another game in my previous tournament where I ran into a very similar thing. It didn't go exactly the same way, and there actually wasn't sort of as nice of a way out of it as there was with this one. But yeah, it's obviously something that I need to internalize and learn a little bit better because oh man, like I totally would have been winning if I had just taken the bishop, and I didn't. I moved the queen over, and the game went like this. The bishop went back. I damaged the pawn structure, and then I brought my queen to b5, just putting some immediate pressure there. They defend with their king. And I bring out the rook just to activate and try to get my pieces active. I'm down a pawn, but it's not the end of the world, right? They have a very damaged pawn structure over here still. The pawn structure is a bit damaged over here. The knight's on the edge of the board. I still should be able to have a decent position. I think white is better, but not by much. Actually, let's have a look. Who's better? Actually, black is still better in this position. So minus 0.2, 0.3, something like that. So pretty equal now, but it's still a game. So white plays d5, and I decide to capture. I just didn't want any ideas of the pawn pushing with a rook behind it and a bishop covering it. So I captured, rook comes down, and I get my queen out of danger. And then he plays d3, queen d3. And this is where I sort of made two mistakes at the same time. So the first mistake that I did is I didn't see the strength of just simply playing b5 here. And the reason b5 is nice, actually, I'm just realizing something interesting. Can't he just take with the rook? When I was looking at the game earlier, I didn't notice that, but the engine doesn't like it. Does he just, what if he takes with the rook, then what? Oh, then there's a fork. Oh, isn't that interesting? This is a live discovery process here. So that's kind of interesting. I hadn't actually seen when I was calculating this variation that the rook could potentially take, and then there's a fork. Huh. So that's interesting. But anyway, that aside, let me turn the engine back off. This move is nice, and I was looking at it because this knight doesn't really have anywhere to go. Now, when I was calculating it in the game, obviously the knight can't go here or here, and the knight can't go here because it will just be taken. But I thought that the knight could just go here, and I felt like that's like where the knight wanted to be anyway, right? Because it's a nicer square than over on the edge. But the thing is, if the knight comes here, let's just play it out. If the knight comes here, it's only defended by the rook, and I can chase the rook away pretty easily. The rook can only go here in order to maintain protection of the knight, and I can, do a number of moves to kick it away, and then win that knight. Actually, I think the best line, according to the engine, is this, counterattacking my knight. But in a pretty nice turn of events, I can then just capture anyway, and I'm defending my knight. And then there's like a move like here, and there's a bit of chaos that happens, but black still ends up being better. So let's go back. So I didn't play that because I just didn't calculate deeply enough to see that the knight was not safe there. So I played this, and I've labeled this a blunder, but it's a blunder for a bit of a subtle reason. It's kind of this wild tactic that I thought might make sense. What I was calculating is you can't take with the pawn because of the pin, of course. So you have to take with the rook. You don't want to take with the queen because then you just lose your queen. So you take with the rook, I take with the bishop, and you take with the queen. And then my thought was, when I was calculating this from a distance, is now I get to win this pawn, which is important because trading two pieces, like a bishop and a knight, for a rook is generally not seen as a good trade. If you can also win a pawn, then it's better. But even so, it's generally not great to trade two pieces for a rook. But my thought was the queen comes up here, and now I'm hitting this rook, and I'm putting pressure on a bunch of stuff. And I thought that after this, white, and this is also a blunder, let me show you why in a minute, but I thought after this that white might just have to put the rook here, and that just seemed like a pretty passive square for the rook. And then it seemed like maybe that's enough compensation. I can get my rooks onto the central files, and I can launch some kind of attack against the king, and maybe we're good. But let's go back. We played it out to here, and then I realized my mistake, which is, of course, since I traded off my dark squared bishop, the dark squares around my king are like Swiss cheese, right? Like the dark squares are terrible. And so if I end up taking here, black can also just play bishop h6. And now that comes with a tempo on the rook and a checkmate threat. And there is a way out of it. Like the engine says I can play this and the game goes on, but that seems kind of weakening and a little bit scary. So at this point, I saw bishop h6 and queen g7, and I thought, I don't want to have anything. I don't want to have anything to do with that, right? And so, unfortunately, that means I traded two pieces for a rook without even picking up a pawn. And so, but I thought, okay, maybe I can still get that pawn if I move this rook over here, hitting the queen, and then if the queen goes here and or here, trying to stay on the diagonal, and I go over here, then maybe I can chase the queen away, right? I can get the queen off of these dark squares, and then I can grab that and maybe threaten the bishop and all this other stuff. And this was almost the right idea. This was almost the right idea. The reason why it doesn't work is because queen e4 is pretty powerful. Offering a queen trade, if I move my queen away and don't defend this pawn, then I'm going to lose a pawn. And it just, like, I think there are better moves than to do the queen trade. Like, I think the engine likes queen c8, and then it kind of keeps putting pressure on this pawn. I just ended up trading queens here, but let me show you that actually the right idea was this, to put the other rook on d8. And the reason that works is because after queen e4, I can play b5 again. And this knight, like, nothing has changed with this knight's position from when I was talking about it a few moves ago. The knight still only has this square, but it doesn't anymore, right? Because even after the queen trade, which is possible because the rook is on c8, now this rook has nowhere to go, and this rook is going, or sorry, the knight. This knight is going to be lost, right? And so interestingly, I almost had the right plan, but I moved the wrong rook because now this doesn't work because, if I push b5, I just lose my queen. And also, even if I could somehow magically, trade queens in this position, then the knight would just simply have the c5 square, and it would be perfectly safe because there's no rook on c8. So I almost found the right idea, but not quite. And so like I say, probably queen c8 would have been better. I think that's what the engine likes. I just went ahead and traded because I didn't really know what else to do. Like I was pretty rattled. Like I had missed the whole pawn being pinned to the queen earlier, and so that kind of rattled me. And then I felt like I was just starting to gain ground, and then I tried this tactic and it didn't work out. And so I was just like psychologically not in a very good place for this game anymore. And so the game is lost at this point, but I still felt like I could fight for a draw. Like there's an interesting imbalance. I have the extra rook for the two pieces, and this knight is not very good right now. And so we played on. I played f5, and he played e5 to because if takes, then I just activate my rook. It was a little bit of hope chess on my part, to be honest, because I wanted to get that rook active. I moved b6 to take the c5 square away from the knight, and then he just simply pushed c4 in order to give the knight away to get back into the game. But that also weakens the d4 square, and so I planted my rook there, which I felt was pretty nice. He moved the bishop out of danger, and then this is annoying because the logical follow-up to rook d4 is rook f to d8, but of course the bishop is covering that square, and so I can't even double up my rooks on this open file, which would have been really great, but very well played by my opponent here in the endgame. So I moved over, putting pressure here. Of course, he just pushes this pawn, and now that pawn is a very powerful protected passed pawn. I played king g7, thinking that maybe I could push h6 at some point to kick this bishop away. And then this set of moves, actually, I've sort of been admiring looking at this game. The knight came to c3 with a tempo on my rook. I moved my rook out of danger. The knight then came to d5 with another tempo on my rook. The rook moved out of danger. And then the bishop comes down to f6 with a tempo on my king. And so the imbalance here is, well, there's a material imbalance, but also the fact that white has two pieces against my rook. Over here, those two pieces were not like as active as they could be. And in this sequence of moves, with a tempo on every move, look how beautifully placed those pieces are now. This bishop is like really causing problems on my side of the board. The knight is causing problems. They can put the rook behind this pawn, start pushing it, and this rook still can't get on the only useful file. So, and of course the knight is blocking that file now too on a beautiful outpost. So I really admire this set of moves by white. Really instructional set of moves here. So he plays rook h2. We kind of shuffle around. I put my rook over here, thinking that maybe I can try to break something up on this side of the board and get some activity. Rook e2, probably looking to push that pawn. So I move my rook to c6 and try to blockade that square. I could have blockaded it with the king, and I do a little bit later. I'm not sure why I didn't think of doing that now, but anyway, rook c6 is fine. h4, a5, again, thinking maybe I can make something happen over on this side. Bishop moves back, and I blockade with the king. And then knight moves back, and I'm not sure if I totally understood this during the game. I kind of wonder if maybe he's looking to bring the knight in even further into my position, perhaps, or to just simply grab this file with his rook. And so I moved my rook back because I want to grab this file. He gets it first. I put my rook there anyway. We trade, and then the knight comes back where it was. But now, since I've pushed a5, this pawn is backwards. So I ended up throwing in a check and then going to defend this pawn. But now this passer is probably just going to start working its way down the board. Of course, I do have my rook back here, so I can potentially cause some problems with it coming down the board. But I mean, the bishop is covering this square, right? And this knight could very easily be covering this square. And so this pawn is going to be causing problems. He brought the knight in here, which hits this pawn. And now at this point, like, I don't remember if I was like running into some time trouble or if I was just like, I feel like sometimes when the game is basically lost anyway, I just kind of start playing a little bit quicker and less carefully. Like, it's definitely a bad habit, but I think that's part of what was going on here. I was just kind of trying to play quickly and cause some problems and try to, I don't know, make something complicated and make some cause him to make a mistake or something like this, you know? But it didn't work. So rook f3, just hitting this pawn. King goes back here, defending and hiding from checks. And now rook e3, just to cover this file. The knight grabs my h-pawn. And now I decide, all right, I want to grab this pawn, and then maybe I can grab this one and this one. So let's bring the king up here. And again, not playing very carefully, I did so, and this is checkmate. It's kind of a nice checkmate, actually, with the bishop covering that. And, you know, basically the pawns covering every other square that I could possibly go to. So very, very interesting game. Obviously, you know, it would have been nice if round one went my way, but still a very interesting game and definitely some good lessons. So let me go back to move 17 here. And I already talked about this, but yeah, this is a really good lesson for me, is again, just trying to practice or understand or think about these sorts of pins where it's this weirdly nuanced type of pin, that is a valid pin in certain circumstances, but not others, which is very interesting. I guess it's probably similar to, like, I don't know, if there's a rook pinning something to another rook, like it sort of depends on whether the rook on the other side of the pin is also defended, right? So I shouldn't have so much trouble with these, but I seem to. And then, you know, both being able to see that this pin is potentially going to be dangerous if the knight goes there, and then also seeing that this gets me out of the pin and actually wins material. Like, that would have been a really great find. I really wish that I had seen that. But the next one I would say, which is interesting, is in this position where I played this. And I think there are a couple of things to learn here. First of all, I just simply miscalculated that eventually my dark squares were going to be weak, but I think the lesson is that when I'm going to trade off like two pieces for a rook in this case, like if there's going to be an exchange of pieces, it's important to see like not only what kind of tactics and what the exchange is going to be, but then like what the position is going to be like afterward. And in particular, I was trading off a very important bishop for this rook, like bishop and knight for this rook. If it was only the bishop, then sure. But, well, I should say probably. If it's only the bishop, then it probably works. But the bishop and the knight, given that the bishop is so important, like it's an important defender of the dark squares around my king. And so I should really think twice about giving up that bishop for an exchange that I'm not entirely sure about, right? Because even if I hadn't calculated it all out to see that there was going to be this bishop h6 thing and a mate threat, just seeing that the dark squares were going to be weak probably should have given me enough pause to think about the fact that maybe I'm not going to be able to win this pawn. And even if I could, maybe this is just simply not better for me because I've given up too much of my strength for not enough compensation, right? So anyway, pretty interesting, pretty important lessons. Let me switch back to my camera here. I hope that was interesting for you. That was it was a great round one. And you know, again, it would have been nice to start off the tournament with a win, but I was happy with the lessons that I learned from this game. So I hope you learned something as well. If so, hit the like button down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, definitely subscribe. And if you're interested in the other game in my previous tournament where I ran into a very similar like pawn pinned to a queen by a queen thing, you can check that video out here. And I will see you in the next one.